Okay, good evening everybody, and we're pressing on with Yiras Hachet, the fear of sin, a very non-PC kind of subject, difficult to talk about fear of anything, let alone fear of sin. We live in a world where fear is a very negative word, but in point of fact, a lot of our actions have to be motivated by the fear of, as we saw in the first part of Mesilas Yesharim, the fear of Onish. Now, we discussed this last week. There are really three parts to this idea of the fear of sin. The first part is what's called Yiras Onish, the fear of getting punished. This, says the Mesilas Yesharim, the Rambam says, is really for only people who are not on a very sophisticated level, people who, but it's a level in itself, and halavai, we in our present generation should be able to get to that level. Nowadays, we don't want to think about that. That's something that's very difficult to talk about. But that's an essential part of Judaism, which is basic to our understanding that our actions have results. An action is not something which just you can do and it doesn't really matter. No, things matter. The basis of all belief in God is things matter. My life matters. The opposite of depression, the opposite of happiness is not unhappiness, it's apathy. Apathy means nothing really matters. So the whole idea of onish, punishment, implies that what I do matters, is significant. But that's the lower level. The high level which we're dealing with now is what's called Yiras Chet, which is not the fear of punishment, it's the fear of doing the sin itself, and this divides into two parts. The one we discussed last week is called Yiras Aromamus, which is translated in English as awe, A-W-E. The awe that a person feels when he comes to serve Hashem, when he realizes and thinks about how great Hashem is, and he thinks about how small he is. So this will give him this awe of at the time when he's doing something which is applicable to the service of Hashem. That's the first part of this second topic, second aspect of sin, fear of sin. But there's another more constant part of that which is called Yiras Hachet. Even though Yiras Hachet is a general term for Yiras Hachet and Yiras Aromamus, Yiras Hachet really is this constant awareness, a constant feeling, a constant fear that maybe I'm doing something which is not quite right. Maybe I didn't do something quite right in the past. We'll see. That's where we're going to start off today. So he says that the essence of Yiras Hachet, Vinei Hinei Inyonahu, is that the person should be constantly afraid about his deeds. Let pen nisarev behem eze shemetz chet. Maybe there's some kind of aspect, some speck of sin mixed into them. Or maybe something small or great that's even not technically a sin, but it's incompatible with the kavod of Hashem. There's a certain attitude that a person has when he realizes the greatness of Hashem, that even something may not be directly labeled a chet or an aveir or a sin, but it's just incompatible with the glory, the kavod of Hashem. And maybe he did something which was not quite the way it should be. So, we can now see the great association between this kind of yira, in other words, fear of sin, and Yiras Aromamus, the awe of Hashem's exaltedness, which we mentioned above, because basically the objective of both is the same, which is not to do anything contrary to the amazing exalted glory of Hashem, Baruch Hu. What's the difference? I said before is that why is Yiras Chet considered to be separate? B'Shem Echad Tikra, and it's called a different name, Yiras Aromamus, Yiras Chet, is that Yiras Aromamus, awe, is something that applies, as I said before, only at the time of the deed itself, whereas Yiras Chet applies Yiras Aromamus applies either during the time of the service, or if a person turns away from the opportunity to do a sin because of the awe he has for Hashem. However, the Yiras Hachet is something which basically is going to happen all the time. For somebody who has attained this trait, v'yaseh dava or chetzi dava, neged kavod shmo yisbarach hamu, because anything he might do that's an act or even a partial act that's contrary to the glory of Hashem, blessed be He, is constantly in this constant fear of sin. It's not fear of Hashem, so to speak. For in essence, it's a dread of maybe he did something wrong. Lest shalo yikones v'yisarev b'ma'aseh, that maybe he's constantly on the alert that it shouldn't mix into any of his actions in any way whatsoever. Now, of course, I think it has to be said here that when you read this, it's very easy to think of somebody who's like this sort of trembling, nervous wreck going around. Now, clearly, that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about somebody who's neurotic. We're not talking about somebody who's OCDC. We're talking about people on the almost the highest level of connection to Hashem. A person like this, you would never realize that's what's going underneath. Underneath him is this constant awareness, this constant sensitivity to the fear of doing something which is in any way not in line, not appropriate to the kavod of Hashem, let alone a sin in itself. A person like this, you would never see this. On the surface, one of the things that struck me about all the Gedolim, the great people that I ever had the privilege to meet, is that on the surface they seem extremely normal. In fact, they kind of redefine what normality is. Everybody, in comparison to them, doesn't seem to be quite as normal as they are. And yet, under the surface, what's going on is something which is a constant work on themselves, a constant supervision, a constant sense of the presence of Hashem. Shavisi Hashem lenegdi somid. They constantly have this awareness that they're in the presence of Hashem, and this, of course, means that they're constantly on their guard to not do anything which could be in any way, however small, in any way not appropriate to the honor of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the honor of God. But of course, this is, as I say, we're not talking about somebody who's a trembling wreck. Okay, so with regard to the Yesharim as the constant concern, we see in Mishlei it says, Asher Adam mafached tomid. Happy is the man who is constantly in a state of fear. Again, you have to put this into what I just said. This the Chazal explain in Brachas in 60 that Hahu b'divrei Torah k'siv. Let's talk about divrei Torah, meaning a person is constantly aware and on his guard not to do anything which is going to break any rule of the Torah or anything which is not in absolute harmony with the Torah, way the Torah expects a person to speak, think, and act. For even one does not see she'eino roya amachshelik neged einov tzorech sheyeh libo hored b'kirbo. Even one somebody who doesn't see anything that's a problem coming up, but he constantly has to be aware, so to speak, of the possibility. What's hiding behind the next tree in terms of his spiritual awareness? What's chet is waiting there to ambush him? What small stumbling block may he find? So this is what just would maybe do the first, the Moshe Rabbeinu that says, "Va'avo tieh yiroso al peneichem levilti sechatu." That's what it says in Shmois. The reason for this overwhelming experience that the Jewish people had at Har Sinai with the giving of the Torah was, quote, so that the awe of Hashem should be constantly upon your faces, so that you will not sin. For this is the principal aspect of Yira. Kizeh ikah Yira. Shihu ha'adam yirei u'mizdazeh atomid, that a person should be constantly fear and tremble about the possibility of doing a chet, to the point that this fear never leaves him. For as a result of this constant fear, he will surely never come to sin. And if it happens despite this that he comes to sin, it will be considered to him as being it's completely ba'oines, beyond his control. So he now goes on to bring other similar examples by Yeshayahu, Isaiah, and then he says, the Ramchal says a logical proof. In other words, Kavar Matzanu, Shama Malchim Hagadolim. Indeed, we find the great and exalted angels. constantly quake, constantly in a state of fear and trembling in front of the grandeur, the honor of Hashem. And then he brings sources for this, and then he goes on to say that, brings sources for this. Eliphaz, then Eov's friend, he brings various quotations from Chazal, which I think we'll move on, and we won't do them. Now we're going to go on the discussing our Yiras HaChet, the fear of sin. We've moved on from Yiras HaRomamus. The Yiras HaChet has two elements. One is Echad Hu Behove or Osid. One is in the present or the immediate future, and the second one V'Hasheni Ba'ava. The second one concerns the past. Now, concerning the present or the future, a person is going to be constantly, as we said before, concerned about what he's about to do, lest there be something in what he's doing or what he's about to do which may have some small feature which is not 100% within the accordance of the way his behavior should be in front of a Kodesh Baruch Hu, as we wrote above. And what about the past? There's a Yiras Chet which about the past means Sheha'adam Choshev Tamid Al Mashikava Asa, on something that, on what he's already done in the past. Yira v'yidog, and he should be fearful and concerned that perhaps some sin has emerged from his actions without his awareness. In other words, he has to be concerned that even though he may not have done something which in itself was a chet, but maybe he set up a situation which was as a result of something which was not 100%. Obviously, it's not something he was totally blameless for otherwise, but something that maybe set up a situation without his awareness that something came out from it which was a chet, a sin. For who Ke'inyan Bava Ben Buta, let's talk about the story of Ben Buta, who would every day bring an Osham Tolui. An Osham Tolui literally is an Osham, which is a sacrifice, Talui, which is dependent. A sacrifice which depends on, maybe he'd sinned inadvertently. And he brings some psukim for that. And then he brings two other examples of Moshe and Aaron, where they were constantly concerned about something maybe they did, which something from there will come out which is something bad. Moshe and then the Kodesh Baruch Hu allays both the fears of Moshe and Aaron. And we see also true the same idea with Avram and Lot. And says the Chamchal, conclusion, V'hizos hayira ha'amitis sham omrulov. This is the true level of Yiras HaChet, of which we say about Avram, who's described as a truly God-fearing person. That's when we say about Vazos, who's Yiras Amitish, Shamrolov about Avram Avinu, Ein lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hu ba'olamoy, Ein lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu ba'olamoy. Hashem does not have anything in his world, Ela oitzer shel Yiras Shemayim bilvad, only a storehouse of the fear of heaven. That is what he has, and that was said about Avram Avinu. So this is the Kodesh Baruch Hu has nothing else, as we said, in this world except the storehouse, and it's up the storehouse of Yiras Hashem. And that's the level of Yira that was easy to attain for one person and only one person, Moshe Rabbeinu, who had the greatest closeness to Hashem, and of course the closer one is to Hashem, in a sense the easier it becomes to attain this level. Due to his mipnei rov deveikuto boyet barach, because of his great attachment to Hashem. Because for other people, this kind of year is difficult to attain because of their physical nature. It's a great barrier for them in attaining this. Moshe Rabbeinu, as we said in previous weeks, was somebody who had the minimum attachment to the physical, which allowed him to still exist in this world. Any less physicality, and he would not have been able to actually exist in this world. But everybody else who's on a lower level than this will find it proportionately and progressively more difficult. Nevertheless, it's appropriate for kol chosid v'chosid. Again, we're talking, mustn't forget, we're right at the end of the book here with the level of chasidus. People who go way beyond the letter of the law. But anybody who is on that level and wants to be on that level and has managed to get this far in his ascent, his path, his finding his path up to this point, he should try and achieve this level, this trait. As it says, Yiras Hashem, Yiru es Hashem Kadoshov. This is talking, you holy ones, fear Hashem. In other words, a person is exhorted to increase their level of Yerushalayim. Okay, so we're going to move on now. How does one acquire this Yiras Achet? How does one acquire that? So it says, Ach derek niyas ha'yira hazos hu has boinen al shnei inyonim amitiim. The way a person does this is to be constantly focused, constantly review, and constantly bring to mind, because these things are not self-evident. A person, again, this is a fundamental part of how to work on yourself, is a person has to set times in the day where he actually consciously and actively reminds himself, and the two things in order to acquire this trait, the two things he has to constantly remind himself about are that Echad Hashem's is everywhere. Hashem's Shechina is all around. He's surrounded, he's standing in front of the Shechina at all times. There is no place absent from Hashem. That's something that, of course, that we go through our lives almost totally blithely unaware of for the vast majority of the time. But in order to achieve this midah, a person has to constantly remind himself of this fact. And the second is that Hashem sees everything. Yiras Hashem, part of Yiras Hashem is that Hashem is looking at me right now. Hashem is looking at me. He's listening to me. He's seeing me. A person who wants to achieve this midah has to have these two things constantly in his mind, that Hashem is everywhere. I'm in front of Hashem wherever I am. And Hashem sees everything I'm doing and everything I'm thinking, every single minute of my life. By focusing on these two ideas, a person will naturally, a person will, through a lot of hard work, get to this level of fearing Hashem, Yiras Hashem, which will be, when he does a mitzvah, have this awe of the presence of Hashem, and also that he will be very careful not to do anything. He'll go through his life with a constant awareness of what's coming up and what was, and examine those things very probingly to make sure that it's not going to end him, take him to somewhere he doesn't want to be. Okay, so first of all, without explaining, and I've gone to some way to maybe explain a little bit of an introduction, how Yiras Achet is derived from these two ideas, these two truths, that it should be a person, the fight of a person's eyes. So he brings support for this. Hu Masha Omer HaKosuv, it says, Meloi Chol in Yeshaya, it says that, how do I read this? Sorry, Mechol Kol Aretz Kvodo, the Hashem's, the whole world is filled with Hashem's honor, with His glory. So that's referring to the first idea. V'halo es hashamayim ve'es ha'aretz ani molei. Same idea again. Hashem fills all of existence. He brings another source for that, and then he goes on to say, v'chevin shenizbare eloi b'chol makom hu. So once a person understands that Hashem is everywhere, and he's standing in Hashem's presence wherever he is, in front of the Shekhinah, so then automatically this will bring a fear and dread to enter him. Why? Because lest he stumble in front of Hashem. He's in front of Hashem. And maybe his actions will not be befitting, as we said before, not an achet, but just they won't be befitting to Hashem's exalted glory. Again, he brings from the Chazal, Mala, so he says, Da, Mala Mimcha. No, ponder three things. So the first thing is, think about three things and you won't come to sin. Number one, Da, Mala Mimcha. Know what's above you. And, which is, Ayin Ro'ah, an eye that sees. And Ozen Shamas, an ear that hears. V'chol ma'asecha b'sefer nichtavim. And all of your actions are written down in a book. They're all remembered. Nothing is forgotten. Kivan hashkachas HaKadosh Baruch Hu al kol davar. So seeing as Hashem sees everything, this in itself will bring a person to remember and make sure all his actions will be written in a book, he therefore, with this in mind, will be extremely careful. But as I said before, omnam, this realization has to be constantly reinforced. It's not something that can be done overnight. And it's not something that will be done by doing it once or twice. It's something for omnam. Adraza enom etztaer heitiv b'seichel ha'odam ela al dei hatzmodus ha'hisbonenus. In other words, as much as one would want to say that intellectually this is something which is a very logical idea, can be understood. But intellectual ideas don't have an impact on a person by themselves. A person can think something and 5 minutes later it's gone from his mind. The only way anything sticks is by making a constant intellectual effort to bring again and again and again and again up to one's conscious mind these truths. Then they have a way of embedding themselves into a person's worldview, his emotional reality. It cannot be firmly envisioned by man's intellect except through constant contemplation and intense reflection upon these truths. For since the matter is far from the perception of our senses, not something that we see, it's far from obvious to our eyes, and therefore it has to be something which we constantly conjure up in our minds. And without doing that, the mind will not contemplate this. And even after one has conceptualized this, as I said before, Yisor hatzio mimenu benekel. This is, as I said before, this idea, this intellectual idea will depart almost immediately when a person turns his thoughts to other things. Okay, so I think we're going to pause here and we'll carry on next week, B'ezrat Hashem, with identifying what's going to undermine Yiras Chet. I think it's going to be pretty obvious, but we'll talk about the things that detract from Yiras Hashem.